The great Turkish city of Istanbul, with the outline of its magnificent blue mosque dominating the skyline, stands at the gateway between Europe and Asia. During more than 4 centuries, it was the seat of the sultans who ruled the Ottoman Empire. And 1,000 years before that, it was the ancient capital city of Christendom, Constantinople. It used to be said that every schoolboy knew the date of the fall of Constantinople. 1453 was seen as a watershed in world history, the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of modern times. But how many of those well-informed schoolchildren would have been able to say who conquered it, or would have known that at its height, the Ottoman Empire was one of the most formidable powers in world history? Let us suppose for a moment that it is the 12th of September, 1683. For 3 months, a Turkish army some 200,000 strong has held Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Habsburgs, under siege. Today, with the aid of troops sent by the rulers of Germany, Italy, Spain, and Poland, the Austrian emperor is striking back. The Turks have been overconfident. Assuming that they could take Vienna before the arrival of any relief army, they have failed to fortify their camp. The Christians exploit this weakness, and at the end of the day, it is the Christian allies who are victorious. In spite of the fact that its walls have been destroyed, Vienna has survived, and the Turkish threat has been averted. Everyone agrees that the crucial factor was the arrival of the Polish forces, led by their king, Jan Sobieski. Without them, the Christians would not have been strong enough to risk an attack on the Turks. As Vienna weakened, all eyes had turned to Sobieski. In response, the Polish king had assembled an army of 23,000 highly trained men. But on the 15th of August, they had still been at Krakow, 1,000 miles from Vienna. Then, after a lightning march through the mountains, the Poles had joined up with their allies near the Danube. It was the end of August. By the 10th of September, they were some 80,000 strong. 2 days later, they attacked the Turkish forces. It was a total success. Even the Grand Vizier was forced to abandon his sumptuous pavilion, the main tent of purest Chinese silk and gold brocade, studded with gems and scarlet tassels. The ordinary soldiers, too, left behind their weapons, their jewelry, their furs, and their carpets. The relief of Vienna in 1683 proved to be a turning point. Although the Poles went home, the Imperial army continued to roll back the Ottoman forces until by 1699 all of Hungary was in Habsburg hands. The Turks never again threatened Europe. But for more than 300 years, the tide had flowed the other way. From humble beginnings, the Turkish sultans had created an empire that stretched, in the mid-16th century, from Budapest to Basra, from the Crimea to Cairo, and from Algiers to Arabia. The origins of Turkish power should perhaps be sought some 400 years before, when in 1258, with appalling brutality, a Mongol army took and sacked Baghdad, capital of the Islamic world. That too was a turning point. From Baghdad, the Abbasid caliphs had exercised a general spiritual authority over the majority of Muslims since the mid-8th century. After 1258, although the states which arose on the ruins of the caliphate eventually became Muslim, no single Islamic authority was ever again able to assert any general leadership over all the faithful. We first hear of the Turks during the 6th century in Central Asia, where the Chinese gave them the name Dugwe. Moving steadily westwards, they came to control the silk bazaars of Samarkand and later advanced to the borders of Anatolia. There were many tribes of Turks. Some of them became Muslims and spread further westwards, joining from the 8th century the armies of the caliphs and fighting against his enemies. But after the sack of Baghdad in 1258, there was a power vacuum between the Mongol Empire and the Byzantine Empire. This no-man's land became the realm of the Ghazis, or warriors for the faith, and many Turkish tribesmen were attracted to the area. Of the 10 main groups of Ghazis, the one nearest to the Byzantine city of Bursa became the most important. It was led from about 1281 by a Turkish chief called Osman, from whom the dynastic name Ottoman is derived. After several successful actions against Byzantine forces in the field, Osman led his forces in the siege of Bursa. It fell after a 5-year blockade in 1326 and at once became the dynasty's capital. The Ottomans turned Bursa into a center of art and learning, and all the early sultans are buried in the city's green mosque, in magnificent tombs such as this one. Gradually, the Turks were becoming settlers as well as nomads, and their leaders were becoming rulers as well as chiefs. Osman's son, Orhan, began to mint his own coins, a sure sign of independence and permanence, and he recruited the services of Christian administrators. As the Ottomans became better organized, the services of their successful troops were soon in demand. In 1346, Orhan loaned some 5,500 of his soldiers to a Byzantine nobleman who wished to become emperor. Thanks to Turkish help, he succeeded. In return, Orhan was given the new emperor's daughter as a bride, and the Turks were able to expand from their existing territory in western Anatolia to occupy parts of Thrace and the useful port of Gallipoli on the European side of the Bosphorus. Orhan sent large numbers of Turkish nomads to settle in the rich new European lands conquered by his army. When he died in 1362, he had doubled the size of the Ottoman state to about 30,000 square miles. Murad I, the third sultan, immediately increased his hold over Europe. In 1362, he captured Adrianople, second only to Constantinople in importance as a Byzantine city. Murad renamed it Edirne and made it his capital. Later, the Ottomans embellished the city with the Selimiye Mosque, one of the most splendid mosques in the Islamic world, which can still be seen today. The next year, Murad signed a non-aggression pact with Byzantium, which enabled him in 1364 to defeat a Christian army from the Balkans sent to throw the Turks out of Europe. In 1389, another army raised by the Balkan princes was overwhelmed at Kosovo. Murad was killed, but the victory was total. His son Bayezid went on to annex Bulgaria and to humble Serbia. In 1396, at Nicopolis, Bayezid also defeated and massacred a large crusading army. The Ottoman state now stretched from the Danube to eastern Anatolia and covered some 267,000 square miles. Already the empire displayed many of the hallmarks for which it was later famous. At the capital, Edirne, with the Sultan and his family, the tribe of Osman was still the core of the state, but beyond this the Ottomans adopted the traditions of the lands they conquered and of the people who joined them, whether Muslim or Christian. But there were also innovations, particularly in the army, where the free Ghazi raiders of Osman and Orhan were replaced by highly trained troops, specially recruited from among youths captured during the Balkan Wars. These were called the New Force, the Yenicheri, known in English as the Janissaries. Murad also conscripted Christian boys from the Balkans and trained them in Turkish language, law, and faith. The best recruits entered the administration. The rest became Janissaries. The rounding up of likely lads known as devshirme was rendered easy by the dislocation that accompanied the Turkish conquests. Not only were prisoners taken in battles and raids, the threat of war or the destruction of property caused many to flee. And the Black Death, which affected Eastern as well as Western Europe after 1347, also drove many refugees into the arms of the sultans. But for most of the subject peoples, the Ottoman conquest brought peace and stability after almost 2 centuries of troubles. The Turks followed the traditional Islamic policy of toleration towards the peoples of the book, that is, Christians and Jews who accepted the same one God. Indeed, Ottoman rule in the Balkans was normally less oppressive than the system it superseded, in which feudal dues and labor services had weighed far more heavily on the population than did the Sultan's taxes. But in Asia, Ottoman expansion was less popular. In the 1390s, Murad's son, Bayezid, the victor of Nicopolis, began to attack his eastern neighbors, demanding that they switch allegiance from their eastern overlord to himself. Those who would not were deposed. Unfortunately for him, this eastern overlord was Timur the Lame, known to us as Tamburlaine, commander of vast armies, conqueror of an empire that stretched from Anatolia to India. In 1402, he outmaneuvered Bayezid and began to sack Ankara, chief city of Anatolia. When the Sultan's forces approached, they were wiped out and Bayezid himself was captured. The Ottoman dominions of Asia Minor were systematically ravaged, and those whom Bayezid had deposed were restored to their possessions. The catastrophe at Ankara might have spelled the end of Ottoman rule, but ironically, the Turks were rescued by their enemies. The Genoese ferried survivors from the battle across to safety in Europe, and Timur died in 1405 before he'd managed to create any successor states in Anatolia capable of matching the Ottoman enclaves left intact. The clock had been turned back, but it had not been stopped. It took Bayezid's son, Mehmed, 10 years to restore a semblance of order to the Ottoman state, and even at his death in 1421, he still ruled only half the area controlled by his father, no more than 110,000 square miles. But it was under Mehmed's son, Murad II, and his grandson, Mehmed the Conqueror, that the Ottoman Empire became a world power. Expansion took place equally in Europe and Asia Minor. In a series of bold strokes, the independent states of Anatolia were once again weakened, defeated, and finally annexed. This brought the Ottoman Empire to the Black Sea and the borders of Syria. In Europe, great gains were made at first by exploiting the civil wars that beset the numerous Christian states of the Balkans and Greece. Some were crusading states run by Westerners. Some were trading colonies run by Genoa and Venice. Some were kingdoms ruled by Balkan princes or by Byzantium. By 1481, the Sultan's dominions had grown to 328,000 square miles. At that size, it was larger than any of its neighbors and possessed an almost irresistible power. The most spectacular single conquest was, of course, the capture of Constantinople, taken in 1453. Its great walls, measuring 100 feet from top to bottom, had withstood many sieges, 7 at the hands of the Ottomans themselves. But Mehmed II was able to concentrate against these ancient defenses, originally built 1,000 years before, the greatest military innovation of the Renaissance, the siege gun. Cannons like these measured over 20 feet in length and hurled stone shot weighing half a ton against the venerable walls of Constantinople. After a 2-hour bombardment, on the 29th of May, 1453, the capital of Constantine fell to the Turks. It was a victory of great importance. It gave the Turks a new imperial capital, which they renamed Istanbul and proceeded to beautify. Even during the city's fall, when the Sultan discovered a soldier plundering a church, he struck the man with his sword, saying, "For you the treasures and the prisoners are enough. The buildings are mine." By the time of his death in 1481, Mehmed the Conqueror ruled a state that was as great as the Byzantine Empire at its height. His neighbors were now Christian Hungary in the northwest and the Mameluke Kingdom in the southeast. Within 50 years, both of these great states had also been destroyed, and the Ottomans now controlled an area that covered more than 1 million square miles. In 1538, Suleiman the Magnificent, perhaps the most powerful sovereign in the world, caused this inscription to be erected in Romania. By the grace of God, I am head of Muhammad's community. God's might and Muhammad's miracles are my companions. I am Suleiman, in whose name the Friday prayers are read in Mecca and Medina. In Baghdad, I am the Shah. In Byzantine realms, the Caesar, and Egypt, the Sultan, who sends his fleets to the seas of Europe, North Africa, and India. It's true that there were some interruptions in Ottoman progress. Perhaps the most famous was the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, in which the Turkish fleet was caught at its anchorage off the Greek coast. 200 of the 230 Turkish warships present were either sunk or captured by a Christian fleet organized by Spain, Venice, Naples, Sicily, Genoa, and the papacy. Senior Turkish officers, sailors and craftsmen captured at Lepanto were murdered in cold blood after the battle. Certainly it was a great victory, but it did not restore to Venice the prosperous island of Cyprus, captured by the Turks in the previous year. Life in Istanbul continued unaffected, for, as the Grand Vizier told the Venetians, "You have singed our beard, but it will soon grow again. But we have cut off your arm, and you can never find another." The first Ottoman sultans who followed each other in direct descent from Osman to Suleiman the Magnificent were all rulers of unusual ability. Orhan, the second sultan, may have been premature in his claim of 1337 to be Marcher Lord of the Horizon and Hero of the World, but his grandson, Bayezid I, fully deserved his nickname Yildirim, Lightning, for he ceaselessly crossed from Asia to Europe and back in his career of rapid conquest. The 18 victorious campaigns of Mehmed II also justify his title of Fatih the Conqueror. His descendant Suleiman also led his armies in person in the battles that so enlarged the empire. But after Suleiman's death, there were few sultans who stood out as great commanders, and it's been suggested that the lack of inspired leadership caused the empire to decline. The quality of the sultans was affected, it's argued, by their style of life, always dwelling among their concubines in the enviably large harem of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Today, the Topkapi Palace is still one of the outstanding monuments to Ottoman achievement. But in spite of the luxurious lifestyle the sultans enjoyed here, the Ottoman army still won battles. Sultans, it seemed, could enjoy their concubines and celebrate victories too. The real failure to arrest Ottoman expansion must be laid at the door of her opponents. In the east, her neighbors remained divided when Mameluke Egypt crumbled, and no other Muslim state came to its rescue. Only Safavid Persia proved a match for the Ottomans, because it combined military power with ideological hostility. The Safavids favored Shiism, while the Turks were Sunnis. Before long, numbers of dissident elements within the Ottoman Empire also espoused Shiism, and either joined the Persian army or staged risings in Anatolia that attracted Persian support. But once again, the Ottoman grip during the 16th and early 17th centuries scarcely faltered. The simple truth was that for all the internal corruption and weakness, the Ottoman state had become so great that no single opponent could match its resources. As an English traveler wrote in 1610, "The Turkish Empire is the greatest that is, or perhaps that ever was, from the beginning of the world." But Lepanto had shown a chink in the armor. The Ottomans lost then because, for once, their enemies were united against them. But 2 years after the battle, the Christian alliance fragmented. Venice made peace, and Spain stood virtually alone. The Turks soon made good all their losses. The sultans had always profited from divisions among their opponents. In the 1540s, they allied with France against the Habsburgs. In the 1580s, they allied with England and the Dutch Republic to the same end. But in the 1680s, the Christian powers became less ready to make common cause with the Muslim rulers. The Habsburgs, defeated in the 30 Years' War, were no longer so feared by their neighbors. In their struggle with the Turks, they could now count on support rather than sabotage from their fellow rulers. Moreover, the Christian armies had perfected new techniques of fighting during and after the 30 Years' War. Where once they had fought in cumbersome phalanxes of pikemen, the Europeans now ranged thin lines of musketeers, reinforced by batteries of field guns against each other. These improvements in tactics were made in the 1630s. Naturally, the Turks were aware of them half a century later, and yet they seemed unable to imitate them. Of course, they possessed muskets and artillery. In siege warfare, they were formidable, but in battle they never managed to organize a continuous barrage of fire as the Christians did. As late as 1770, an Austrian general commented on the Turks' strange reliance upon outdated methods. They have changed nothing in their tactics in 2 centuries, he claimed. They had learnt nothing, and they had forgotten nothing. Yet it did not seem to matter. Although the Turks lost Hungary, they retained Crete, Cyprus, and the Balkans. Their armies and navies remained forces to be reckoned with. Other problems came and went. In the years around 1600, economic difficulties led to group disorders in Anatolia, but the government responded by deporting landless and unemployed peasants to Romania and Cyprus, where their descendants may be found to this day. Despite lawlessness, economic collapse, and military defeat, the Ottoman Empire endured. Even after their repulse at Vienna in 1683, the Sultans still controlled most of the areas that now form Greece, Albania, Romania, and Yugoslavia, as well as the Arab world east of Libya. From their capital city, Estambul, the descendants of Mehmed the Conqueror continued to rule a state that was substantially larger than any in Western Europe. It was not until the first decade of the 20th century that the Ottomans were forced out of all but the furthest corner of Europe, and not until 1918 that 400 years of Turkish rule over the Arab lands finally ceased. Turkey may have been, as the British Prime Minister Mr. Gladstone used to say, the sick man of Europe, but he took a long time to die.